Is that okay? I'm also going to, he said, mute everybody. Hello.
Well, before you mute me, I'm just going to say a huge thank you to Steve and to Terry. Yeah. I've got a cough, so I'm not even going to try and say very much.
Have you? Well, first of all, welcome to this session with Terry Cooke Davies, the reincarnated Terry Cooke Davies. Somebody's got something on, like the Hoover.
I think it's Roger.
Is it Roger?
Is it me?
You mustn't Hoover and listen at the same time, Roger. Can't multitask. Oh, right. Is it you? I can't find the mute everybody button, so forgive me if. So anyway, Terry, I remember. Well, I think I've known Terry for donkey's years. It must be a good 20 odd years, I imagine. When and then he disappeared. Now he's come back, which I'm very glad about. The one memorable phrase that I remember from Terry, and I'm sure there are millions of them, but the one thing that really got me, and he's going to tell me he didn't say it, but he said it was doing the right things right. I think, was that one of yours, Terry? Doing the right things right.
Yeah, I wrote a book with Paul Dinsmore called "The Right Projects Done Right."
And that, well, as you can see, unprompted, that stayed with me because it's not only about creating the collateral, but it's also, you know, bridging that knowing doing gap and actually turning thought into action and doing the right things right. So that's never gone away from me. I think that's a real lesson for life, both in terms of process and ethics as well. Should I also note. So, Terry, you've got a presentation for us. You're going to be storytelling. I must admit, I was going to call it Jackanory because it was 4 o'clock, because most of us remember story time. So over to you, Terry. Welcome and delighted to hear from you again.
Much, Steve. I will hope that the technology works.
Yeah.
When I find my shares button. There we go. And here we should be on.
That's it. Got you. Yeah.
Everybody should now be seeing an introductory slide. It's very kind of Karen and Steve to invite me to talk today, because I really do feel I've got some things that might give you a different slant on the people side of projects. Those of you who knew me in my first incarnation will know that my company was called Human Systems, which I started in 1985, and that'll give you a clue as to where my interests always lay in the sphere of project management. But since I retired from having sold the business to PMI, I retired from PMI in 2016 on my 75th birthday, and I retired from academic work at the end of 2018. So since then, I've had plenty of time for reading and thinking. And although I don't have access to primary sources for research, I have a nice computer and plenty of opportunity to do interdisciplinary research. And I've been looking at projects very much from a fresh perspective. And I've particularly been interested in the huge advances over the last 5 years that have been made about study of human nature. Very much interdisciplinary, very much in the fields of philosophy and psychology, but also neuroscience and cognitive science and consciousness studies. So, and in the course of that, I've become very aware of the role that stories play in lives in general, but in projects in particular. And just so that you understand, I'm coming from a point of view that says projects are very close to the heart of human nature. If you like, ever since we've been around as a species, we've been involved in two things. We've been involved in procreating, and we've been involved in adapting the environment to make it more comfortable for us. And projects have been the way we've been doing that since way before the dawn of history. And stories are very much the way we as a species learn. I'll give a second for the technology to catch up, but you should be seeing a slide here looking at the different stages of a project life cycle where stories play a key role. I mean, when you're getting a project ready for the off, the stories you tell about the project, or the stories that are told about the project, because if it's a big public one, the media will doubtless have their voices in it as well. The stories will raise all kinds of expectations, and different stakeholders will tell different stories about what they're expecting to get out of the project. The right story can really make a big difference to really winning over hearts and minds. One of the things I used to do with PMI was I ran something called the Global the Global Corporation, it was the Global Council, the Global Corporate Council, and we ran 3-day workshops for leaders of project management in large organisations. And at the end, I spent time always giving people time to prepare their elevator speech for when they got back, and people asked them what they'd been doing for the 3 days. And it can make a big difference having really thought through what story you're going to tell. And there are various frameworks you can use. One that I've often found useful is something called the ABT framework, but there are plenty of different, that's ABT, not C, but there are plenty of different ways. And of course, once you hit snags, if you don't grab control of the narrative, you'll find all kinds of narratives start to circulate where you can't have much to do with it. So it really helps if you're able to pick up the stories that are circulating from whichever stakeholder group and put your own stamp on the narratives that are going around. I don't know if any of you read a book by a man called Charlie Pellerin. But Charlie was the director of astrophysics at NASA, and he wrote a book called How NASA Builds Teams. And one of the problems that NASA had to deal with on their big projects, but I guess it's something that we all have to deal with on our projects of whatever size, is the attachment of different members of the project team to their own particular tribe, and the stories tribes will tell about other tribes within the project. Now, in the 70s, in the early days of the oil exploration in the North Sea, consultancies like JMJ and JMW used to earn huge sums of money taking project teams off site for 2 or 3 weeks at startup in order to try and reduce the amount of tribal conflict that went on within a project team. But understanding stories and being able to identify which are the ones that are damaging the project progress and which are the ones that are reinforcing it can be really, really powerful. And then finally, I hope you don't mind me taking a liberty. Just hope can always spring eternal, you know, and who knows what's going to be happening over the next few days. But when it's all over, you hope that there's going to be a successful outcome. And there is nothing like being able to tell stories of both the challenges overcome and the benefits delivered. The last piece of research I was associated with was an intergovernmental study of benefits management practices in 8 countries around the world. And one of the conclusions that we reached as a group was that frequently there's a temptation to define benefits in terms of what you can measure and quantify, whereas very often what stakeholders are looking for is something less tangible than that. And so it does seem to me that there is a very significant study yet to be done around the role of narrative in the benefit stage of projects. If you're familiar with project processes like the PRUB framework, the PRUB framework, there are stories to be told at handover when the project delivers its results and when the results are handed over to the user and when the user operates them to get benefits out of it. Each of those stages has stories that are important. So I just want to make the point that whether you pay attention to stories or not, whether you're in the business of understanding stories and telling stories or not, stories are going to have a big impact on the projects that you're managing. In fact, as I see it, there is a kind of neural cascade with 4 elements that the stories that are circulating lead to the shared context. This particular slide is representing the viewpoint of a single person on the project. They hear stories, and that creates for that person the context in which they understand the project. When their understanding of the context influences their perception, and what they perceive and how they perceive it influences what they do, and of course what they do influences the results. And this isn't just a nice way of thinking about it. There's very, very hard science behind this. And what I'm going to be talking about is based on two very eminent current scientists. One is a philosopher scientist called Ian McGilchrist, who is a neuroscientist and is probably the 21st century's greatest philosopher. He's been called the new Descartes. And the other one is a neurologist and psychologist at Brighton University, Sussex University rather, called Anil Seth, who wrote a book a couple of years ago called Being You. And he is about the leading researcher in the country at the moment into the science of perception. There are many other scholars working in this field. And one of the things that I've been surprised about is to realize that most of us have got the wrong end of the stick when it comes to perception. I don't know how many of you will recognize pictures like this from your textbooks when you were taught about perception. This is a picture about sight, and the pictures all show rays of light originating with an object, going through lenses or whatever into the eye, which has its own lens, and then being acted upon by the brain, where the coloured rods at the back of the eye translated into the back of the eye translated into electrochemical signals that are then transferred down the optic nerve into the brain, where they become part of perception. But actually, that's wrong. That's incomplete, and it's starting at the wrong place. Because before you can be dealing with an image in the back of your eye and in your brain and in your mind of a tree, you've got to look at it. And that is an act of attention and an act of intention. And you will be looking where you are looking because of your understanding of the context and what is important to you. So this is why stories influence what you are looking at and how you are seeing it. But it goes deeper than that, because if Anil Seth's theories are correct, and so far all of the empirical data suggests very strongly that they are, what happens when your brain is looking, in this case, at something? What it will do is it will form a best guess about what it is seeing. And in a Bayesian-like way, it will adjust its guess in the light of information that it receives. And you can check this out yourself by, imagine that you're walking down a street in the fog and you see somebody in front of you, and from the way they're walking and the size and the shape of them, you think, oh, that's a friend of mine. So you speed up, you take action resulting from that. And then as you get closer, you realize that maybe it wasn't your friend after all, and you adjust your perception in the light of incoming information. This is how Bayesian logic works. You start with a guess, and you adjust that guess in the light of new information that comes in. And so bear that process in mind as we go back again and look at this neural cascade, because stories influence the context in which you understand every bit of information you're getting in the project. But the context actually not only governs what you look at, it governs how you interpret it. It sets the prior expectations for the Bayesian logic going on in your minds, which in turn then affects the perception, which is going to drive the action, which is going to drive the outcomes. So you can see biologically and scientifically why stories are going to have a direct outcome on the action. But if that's not enough, I mean, if the neural flow doesn't convince you, then there are the known impacts of stories on human neurobiology. We know much more nowadays that the mind is more than simply something produced by the brain. I've heard it called What the Brain Does, but it's much, much more than that, because the mind is dealing not only with signals coming from the brain, it's dealing with chemicals and signals coming from all over the body. But even more than that, your mind is influenced by what's going on around and outside you as people talk to you, as you observe things, as you read things, as you learn things. And what you see and what you feel and what you hear affect how your body reacts. And we know, for example, that oxytocin plays a key part in making you feel trustworthy, making people feel trustworthy to you and making you trust the group that you're part of. And the very first research that I read when I started studying for my PhD back in the early 90s was a piece of research put out by the Construction Industry Institute in America, and it was called the cost-trust relationship. And it showed quite convincingly how more trust that exists in a project between the client and the project team and members of the project team, the lower the outturn cost will be of the project. And that's largely thanks to the benevolent action of oxytocin produced by your body. But that's not the only. There's a whole cocktail of brain chemicals that can be induced if the right circumstances can be made to apply, if hearts and minds can be one and can be working together. Dopamine, for example, it is the pleasant feeling you get from success. And so stories of achievements reminding people of successes. This is the neurochemical that lies behind gamification, all those annoying little badges you keep getting. It's what governs how many likes you get when you post something on social media. All of this is you're doing it because you like a dopamine kick. In fact, if you're unfortunate enough to be operating in a business with a good news culture, it will be because the management team is addicted to dopamine and doesn't want anything to get in the way of the dopamine fix that they're having. And then there's serotonin, for example. And if people feel good about the way they're contributing to a project, that will improve their own feelings of well-being and happiness. So there's not only the logical flow whereby the stories you tell leads to the outcomes you get, but telling stories during a project, hearing the right kind of stories will create well-being and good moods within the team. It will create exactly the kind of atmosphere that you want. And if that weren't enough, we also know that whatever happens to a person, you have an autonomic nervous system. Incidentally, I created this on AI yesterday evening after Karen said it'd be a good idea for us to have some slides. And I don't know how far you've experimented with AI. I use it a great deal all the time. One thing I've discovered is there is not a publicly available AI system that can spell correctly when it's producing images for you. However, this you can, by the use of the right stories, people can put the right frame around their experiences and maintain a positive atmosphere as they move forward. I think it's also fairly logical that language is the only tool that we actually have as a project manager. There are a few more nuclear options, but for the most part, we get what we get by our language. And a management guru, professor at Harvard, who I have a lot of time for, is called Ron Heifetz. And he says leadership infuses work with meaning. And stories are the quintessentially human way in which we extract meaning from facts. I put this slide up because there are many, many ways. If you take what I'm saying as having any validity, then there are plenty of ways in which you can go deeper and enhance your own skill set in terms of being able to influence the narrative that are circulating on your projects. There are books, there are lots of workshops and courses you can go on, both online and face-to-face. And there are lots of articles and blogs. So there's no excuse for any project leader not being able to develop a robust storytelling skill set so that they can engage and inspire their team, can foster a positive culture, and can effectively communicate complex ideas and values, thereby improving the results that they get. I've put up there how you can contact me, my email, my LinkedIn profile, and a link to my website. But I hope that's given you some things that we can talk about.
Thanks, Terry. Does anybody have any questions? Otherwise, I'll ask a few. Come on, Adrian.
I'm just loving it. It reminds me so much. As soon as you started talking about neuroscience and everything else and stories, I was thinking, yeah, and I kind of just wanted to shout and cheer. I was lucky enough, let me see now, about 12, 13 years ago, and I've been trying to remember the guy's name, Professor Paul, a neuroscientist, basically. And I learned so much about why individuals and teams and organizations react as they do. And he had this result of he and colleagues' research of an emotional scale with fear at one end and trust at the other end. And most of that emotional scale, I think there were seven not stages, but 7 parts of the emotional scale. I think 5 of them were actually towards the fear end of the scale, because he explained to me that when something surprises us, we can't help but react emotionally. There is something called the amygdala deep in the brain, and that absolutely controls autonomically how we react. And you know, and this is just incredible. So loving this stuff. Story is incredibly important. I'm just going to sit back and enjoy. Brilliant, Terry.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you, Adrian. So next up is Hugo.
Hello. Yeah, I focus on benefits management, and as you've highlighted, benefits is why we do projects. And so the benefits management side of things is partly to inform decisions, but the other half of it is to inspire and engage. And absolutely, we need to turn data or themes into stories in order to inspire and engage. Data just doesn't inspire people.
No, that's quite right. It doesn't. Stories are what I mean. Stories are right at the heart of our humanity. You've only got to look at how little kids ask to be told stories all the time. I'm not talking, of course, about telling stories like and sort of in the Hans Christian Andersen sense, but understanding that stories are the way human beings make sense of the world and draw all their conclusions, and that sits right at the top of that neural chain that leads to what results you get. I think is the sort of area in which it behoves project leaders to pay much more attention to than they have. There are some people who are sort of soft skills nuts, and there are a few people who really understand that they can't deliver their huge projects without having the hearts and minds of the teams totally online. We did with human systems. We once did a workshop. It was in Dubai, as it happens, where we asked the members of our network to bring along their most successful ever project managers, and they would talk about why they felt they had been successful. How did they feel they stood out from the crowd? And every single one of them was dealing with human factors. One struck in my mind. It was the person that Shell produced, the person who'd managed the enormous building of an entire new port and refinery and facility running to £1.5 billion somewhere or other. And he said, well, I'm able to be the project manager that I am because I have a handicapped son. And I said, well, how's that linked, John? He said, well, I want my son to enjoy life. And I realized very early on that the only way I could do that would be by engaging him in setting him tasks that he was capable of managing, but that stretched him. And I have done exactly that with my project team ever since I've been managing projects. And as I say, he was Shell's most trusted project manager on their huge mega projects. And you know that a project manager will only be senior enough to manage 2 or 3 mega projects in their lives. So it's a very big decision who you're going to entrust a mega project to. And I was interested that they were usually people who were good at the people side. You have to have the other side as well, but you have to be good at the people side.
And I think it is important to have the science behind it that says you may be very good at telling stories, and let's face it, Nigel Farage is good at telling stories, Donald Trump is good at telling stories, but you need some honesty behind it, and that's where the science comes in that says actually there's some truth in here.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, in the sense, Farage and Trump can get by pointing the finger of blame at other people, but a project leader ultimately has to deliver. We are bound to the truth because somebody will see what we have done and will be able to, that they can touch, feel, and enjoy the deliverables that we have made. So I agree with you. Truth is important, and we more than any others are bound to it.
Yeah, there's an element of trust in that though, Terry, as well, isn't there? And I think the problem with people who ultimately disappoint you is that when you break, or when they break trust with you, the impact is even worse. The comeback is even worse. You know, to wit, look what's going on now in the country at the moment. So it's revenge for revenge's sake at the moment. Anyway, yes. I digress. Gordon, see your hand up.
I think first off, I should acknowledge and say thank you to Dr. Hugo Mini for telling me about this session today. I'd not come across the work of Terry before. I did read the blog associated with the invitation and immediately triggered for me because I too have read extensively around Sir John Whitmore, neuroscience and the like. I recently had a book published by the APM entitled Evolving Project Leadership from Command and Control to Engage and Empower, because everything you said resonates entirely with me. And for your benefit, maybe, I link what you've been saying and what was picked up by, I think, Steve earlier. David Rock, guy, also neuroscientist, put together something called the SCARF model. I don't know if you've come across that. Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, which are all potentially threat triggers, which put us into convergent neuroscience mode, into tunnel vision, and inhibit our creativity and the like, which are precisely what the project leader needs today. The move from management to leadership, almost an oxymoron now to talk about project management, I think, because the project manager is rarely now in a line of control and authority to tell. They're surrounded by subject matter experts, unlike Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who could literally tell everybody what to do. The function and the form of behaviours that follow for the project leader now are much more about those so-called soft skills, anything but. They're very hard, very trying, and only the people that aspire to positions of power and authority, the more maybe the narcissistic end of the scale, by definition struggle with those so-called soft skills, which are about being able to build relationships with people, generate mutual respect and rapport, which then leads to that collaborative atmosphere where the project manager's true function of releasing the synergy of everybody working collaboratively together can happen. So hopefully all that resonates for Terry too, and I've really enjoyed it. One final point I'd offer: stories. Joseph Campbell inspired me and led me on to a book by Sir John Whitmore called The Principles Coaching, the Principles and Practice of Coaching and Leadership. And Stephen Covey also talked about the necessity of trust in building these relationships. So what all of you have said has resonated, and I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Thank you. Me too.
You're back, Rod. Have you gone away or you come back again?
No, I've got to shoot off. I've just put the little clip in.
Thank you for that. I was just going to bring it to people's attention.
Thanks,
Rod's dropped something about trust into the chat, leading into what looks like a little YouTube video. So I shall certainly look at that with interest. Just bring it all to your attention. So next up is Roger. Oh, you're on mute.
Hello. Yeah,
Hello, Roger.
Yeah,
no, you're not. Cool.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, we've been doing sort of similar research over the last sort of 15 years or so. I'm working mainly with David Bride at Liverpool John Moores University, and we come to, obviously come to the conclusion that actually collaboration in projects is where you need to be. Trust and collaboration are much more important than whether you're very good at doing earned value, for instance. Sorry about that, Steve.
Better if you're both.
Yes. Yeah. But I work with the pharmaceutical industry. That is my background. And if you start looking at things like the contracts between suppliers and sponsors, they are designed to put people against each other. They're not in the least bit collaborative. It's like, if you don't do this, we'll send the boys round and break your legs. It's that kind of approach to projects, which is still very, very prevalent throughout the pharmaceutical industry. But if you ask anybody, you stop anybody and say, what makes a project work? And it's collaboration. So why is it not getting through?
My two penneth is because it's very hard work, because it actually, I did a certain amount of work with GlaxoSmithKline on building a collaborative team between the contractor who was building a new plant to manufacture a new chemical that had not yet got its license, but they wanted large quantities of it for the stage 3 trials, and the sales teams and the manufacturing units. And there are a lot of people involved in contracts, and the construction people had their own regulations and rules by which their board judged whether a contract was any good or not, and so you couldn't get the contracts through that would suit the project if it was against the policies of the contracting company. So one of the things you have to do is you have to get cooperation at multiple levels in order to get this kind of collaboration work. And that was why companies that I mentioned, like JMJ and JMW, would spend 3 weeks at very high levels with management at all levels, ironing out the ground rules before they ended up with a contract that suited everybody. David Hancock is extremely good at this, at the multiple levels that have to be done. Last I looked, he was still with IPA in charge of their construction team, but he is extremely knowledgeable about the work necessary to deal with risks in a way that you haven't got this crude using a contract to try and motivate behaviour, which it actually won't do.
Yeah, I can confirm, Terry. David is still at IPA. And I still engulfed in Buckingham Palace, I think, to a large degree. So he's going to see that through to the bitter end. OK, next up is Shirley. Hello, Shirley.
Hello, if I can find the unmute button. Oh, how great to hear someone doing interdisciplinary research. Oh, it's manna of heaven. Absolutely wonderful. I suppose I'm a bit of a soft skills nut. I'm in the RPM team, spend my life as a coach these days. Think that David Drake is wonderful. He does narrative coaching. It's just one model of coaching. And I would just like to ask where else people go apart from storytelling, because storytelling is a bit like leadership. It's like doing it to others. You're trying to influence others. Whereas collaboration is 50-50, maybe you want it 70-30, I don't know, but we can talk about that. But you want something from the other side. So project managers have to be able to tell stories, sure, but they also have to be able to understand how people feel about the stories and engage people enough to participate to make it collaborative. So I'm just wondering, what else have you found in your interdisciplinary research apart from storytelling to make it more collaborative?
This hasn't been in my interdisciplinary research since I retired, but before I retired, and I often felt as if I was banging my head against a brick wall, I was very heavily influenced by the MIT research into dialogue as opposed to debate. And a great deal of work was done by a team of people at MIT, and it's showing up in interdisciplinary ways now. I think the other thing is I was very influenced by Peter Checkland and by his PhD student, now himself a doctor in his own right, Mark Winter. We worked closely together on a project called Rethinking Project Management in the early 90s. The key thing about soft systems approach, Peter Checkland's approach, is that it's no good telling a story that you understand but won't actually resonate with the people you're telling it to. You have to understand their point of view. So very often, a discipline that Mark and I have taught when we've been teaching MBA courses about complex project management is called a rich picture, whereby you don't talk about solving problems, you talk about improving situations, and therefore a starting point is to understand the situation, and you can only understand the situation if you can draw a diagram showing what each significant stakeholder is saying, what do they currently say and believe about the project. So what is their point of view that you have to take into account when you are trying to coordinate and steer a way through it. Those are two different ways. Dialogue and rich pictures are two ways that I found to make. Then there's all the usual stuff about active listening and recognizing that when you're in a conversation. Oh yeah, just as I was on the point of retirement, there was a book published by Donald Shine called Humble Inquiry, and I would strongly recommend it. Basically says you will never learn what people think by telling them, ever. You can only learn what people think by asking them and by listening, and your asking has to be coming from a genuine place, not from a place so that if they sense that what you're trying to do is find an entry to make your point, they know there's something in the interaction that tells them that this is not a genuine inquiry. So the art of humble inquiry, I think, would be a third thing I would add.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Thank you, Shirley. Adrian, did you have your hand up again?
I did. Yeah, I was just intrigued by the question. I forget who it was that put it a few minutes ago about this is all just wonderful. Why do so few organizations and senior leaders and stuff do it? And it just reminded me yesterday, I got invited to and I attended another webinar yesterday. Somebody said, we've got this fantastic model called not project management offices, but value management offices. And I thought, well, okay, I'll have a listen to that. And it was full of brilliant stuff, but none of it was new. It was absolutely fantastic, but it was new lamps for old, really. And the thing I kept on sort of thinking about was, well, all of this is about how we deliver value more effectively, and that's why we do stuff. That's the only reason we've ever done project management and used quotes best practice to have a better chance of delivering value successfully. And yet, over my entire career, still all the research shows that project failure rates haven't changed very much. They're still sort of in the region of 40 to 70% on average cross sector, and yet we've had project management evolve into program management and portfolio management. We've had technology boosting like amazing stuff. We now have AI, and yet there's no change. And whilst there's no simple things, I keep on coming back to the thing that I started discussing with the late great Jeff Rees not long before he passed on to another plane of existence, and that was about the two geographies of projects. There's what happens. Success depends on what happens inside the project and what's going on in the surrounding organizational landscape. And the fact is that most people leading organizations don't know projects. They're not project, their careers have not been in projects. They don't get projects. They've come from business as usual ops backgrounds. And it comes back to your fantastic stories. You've got to win them head and heart first of all. And it's about what the organization culture is. They're not going to go with trust behaviors if the organization culture is one of lack of trust. And I've discovered this around all the work I've been doing with business agility and everything. If you don't have the right organization culture, you're wasting your time. And I've said to some clients, you have a toxic culture for agility. Don't waste your money. I'd love to take your money, but it would be a complete waste. So I think, I think the stories need to start at the top, and we need to sort of win the head and the heart of those at the top and see if we can change some organization cultures.
I agree completely. And I'm reminded of a situation I encountered in about 91 or 92 when I was working with the board of BP Oil. A man called Rolf Stomberg was the chief executive of BP Oil. BP Oil was the downstream part of oil. So BP Exploration dug it up and BP Oil refined it and sent it out to filling stations, crudely. And they had a problem of a board who thought they knew better, and they were always interfering with the capital process and taking decisions and instructing the project manager to go and implement things. So there was a particular project manager who was a Frenchman in charge of project management processes, and he said to the board, "Do you mind if I hire a video crew? Because I want them to come and sit in a board, and we're going to take a note of the decisions you make, and the video crew are going to then follow those decisions downstream, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you the story of what happens to the project as a result of what you said at this board meeting last time." And he followed it all the way down. He followed it all the way down out into the stream, looked at what had to be stood on its head and what was back to front, looked at all the impossible things that people were being asked to do because the board hadn't understood the implications of it, and came back and presented with a professionally made video story that said, here's what happened when you took that decision based on your instinct and ignoring what the project team told you. And I must say that over the 10 years I worked with BP, by the time that it had, and I claim no credit for it whatsoever, I'm reporting as an observer, not as the cause. By the end of it, John Brown stood up and said, it took us 10 years to actually get it that when a project manager presents us with a proposal, we don't ask how much and how long. We say, how reliable are the estimates and what work has been done? How confident are you in what you're saying? And that was a 10-year cultural change program for senior management to realize that how much trust were the project team asking them to place in them, as it were, rather than being distrusted. For all everything you said, Adrian, I totally agree with. I find that all the time.
Yeah.
And
reminds me of
agile
Cotter's
doesn't
work.
work, not because it doesn't work, but because people aren't ready for it.
Absolutely. Reminds me of Cotter's research into the board at Kodak and how they managed to utterly destroy the company.
Yes, exactly. So I mean, I agree. I don't think it's only about people. I thought you were going to make an earlier point, Adrian, when you said about the out there versus the in here, because I think we have loads and loads of models about. I mean, McGilchrist's big point is that we model ourselves to death. We don't work with the real world. We work with a model of it, and all the continuous time we're getting into trouble because our models don't map onto reality. And Sir Geoffrey Vickers had this great concept of history as a stream of events, that you've got events continually happening and thoughts continually happening. And the minute you define something as a problem, you kind of freeze it in time, but life goes on, but your problem is now boxed in and you're busy working with what is inevitably yesterday's situation by the time it comes out. What you should be doing is tracking the situation. So it's actually about what can we do to improve a dynamic situation rather than what can we do to solve a boxed in defined problem, which is only another form of model. And McGilchrist has a great deal to say about that, and he believes that our problem with climate change and the meta crisis that we're in at the moment is largely because we overuse models and representations, which is the way the left hemisphere handles everything that it does, and we don't pay enough attention to human experience, which is what the right brain handles what it's doing. It's don't ever mistake McGilchrist for the old left brain, right brain thinking from Roger Sperry's time. And right brain is creative, creative, and left brain is logical, because it's much more subtle than that. McGilchrist, if you haven't read McGilchrist, I do recommend that you read The Master and His Emissary. Don't start on The Matter with Things. That's a very hard read. I've recommended that to several people who put it down because they can't get it. It's a real scholarly work of great depth and therefore very difficult reading. But The Master and His Emissary is very good to read. And yeah, we spend too much time concentrating on out there, and not enough learning about what makes humans tick, and not enough trust in our own experience, which is where everything comes from. Everything we know through our own experience. If people tell us something, we validate it by our own experience. If it doesn't fly, we don't believe it.
Right. I wanted to use that, if I may, as a jump. I mean, that was brilliant, Terry. And where you've just brought that to absolutely gives me the platform for what I wanted to say we were going to do next on RPM. Because I've just come back from a holiday where we encountered some researchers that were very much looking at the interaction between people and place, and how, I mean, your perspectives model was brilliant, and she'd really was using that to sort of take all sorts of different perspectives on the place and how people had interacted with it. And I don't know how many people are familiar with the work of, I can't remember his name now, Brandon Stanton, I think it was, Humans of New York it started with. And then he went around the world collecting essentially photographs, because it was something, you mentioned language, and you say sometimes academic papers don't get ever out of the academic journals. The idea of using photographs and media and video to really engage with the human stories. So what I think we'd like to do, and I'm interested in views and what have you here, is and about this focus about, as you say, not getting stuck on the problem, but actually looking for the human stories of successes, or what we might frame as successes, in adapting to climate change. Because personally, I mean, it's very easy to get depressed about all the data, all the problems, and all the rest of it. I think what we need to do is uplift people by sharing the success stories of people actually working at the front line of adapting to climate change, because we can argue till we're blue in the face about where the cause is coming from, how much humans contribute to it. Personally, I don't believe the answer is to focus on just reducing our carbon emissions. Of course, we've got to do that. We shouldn't be destroying our home. But actually, looking at how we adapt to change, to the changing climate, and we don't know how much we're contributing to that. And it seems to me hugely arrogant for us to think that we can somehow reverse everything that nature may have a part in. And I don't want anybody want to think I'm a climate denier, because I'm not. Absolutely, climate is changing. And ultimately, whether humans survive or not is going to come down to how we adapt and, dare I say, who we're actually going to save. People are already dying, whether we like it or not. But actually getting some of those human stories out there. And rather than writing lots of words, I'd like to see this go forward, because there's been some talk about us trying to do something more in the artistic domain, in the media domain with RPM. And I'd like to see us really focusing on capturing photographs and very brief narratives that tell the human story of how we are starting to adapt, and people are starting to adapt. And part of my reason, that was an inspiration coming from the researchers I met on holiday, because I went to the place that is warming the fastest on the planet and the way they are starting to adapt. The Humans of New York came to mind, and the various sort of storytelling initiatives there have been. So I don't know whether anybody would like to add to that, Steve or Terry or Shirley or anybody else, or Nick. I noticed you told a very interesting story about your time in India on LinkedIn, commented on today. So I'll shut up now because I'm going to start coughing any minute and let other people jump in now.
Do you want to say something, or I will? You're muted, Nick, by the way. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you?
There's two Nicks. I beg your pardon. This was a very nice talk. Thank you very much, Terry. If I can call you Terry, it's difficult for me to call people their first names. And it was beautiful.
Oh, you're on mute again, Nick.
Thank you. A lot of the observations, ancient civilizations have found out by observation. They have observed that the most successful way is to say stories. Aristotle, Confucius, they're all about relationships first and about vision. You have to share the vision and understand the why will not the how, which is also a book in itself. So all these things, the additional advantage that we have today is that neuroscience gives us an explanation of why that works. On the other hand, we are very worried that this does not happen in companies and all that. I think the reason is that because the soft thing needs more time. And all the higher people are sort of in a hurry. We are always in a hurry. You see, even this election that we have now, nobody actually has mentioned any vision of what they consider, they think the future will look like, whether it is the UK future or the global that has been lost totally in this election. So it is the absence of storytelling actually creates a very bad future. And we as project managers have to work one project at a time, story by story. And what you have brought in is beautiful because it gives both an explanation and also motivates everybody else to actually do the right thing and be sure that this is it, a bit more time, and we will get a better project, a better team, a more motivated team, a more collaborative team, and we need to pass that message on, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. I agree with that. I mean, Karen, I think what you're proposing is superb. It's not unlike what I was saying about BP. A challenge that needs to be addressed, I think, is how to make it attractive to people, because the point that Shirley made about people don't like to be told. And Ed Hoffman published a very good book called Shared Voyage, which is stories of successful projects from NASA. And it had very disappointing sales, but Ed tells the stories really well. People don't just like reading success stories. I mean, Jeffrey Pinto's Why It All Went Wrong, or whatever he wrote a long time ago, had rather better sales. But it seems to me that we need to find a way of telling the story in such a way that people want to hear it. But it's a story that needs to be told, and I fully agree with the video and the what are we doing to it. I also think your point about adaptation is right, because whatever view you take on climate change, it is changing, and the change in temperature is going to mean that large parts of the world that today produce a great deal of food are not going to produce so much food, and people aren't going to be able to work for such long hours and so on. There will be human migration as a result of all of this. So I think that if we can show a story of what project managers and what projects are being done to help us adapt, that's superb.
Thank you, Terry, and I think you've raised a really, really good point there. The story I particularly had in mind from where we went was it had actually, some of the awareness had started to be raised, very sadly, unfortunately, when just over 100 people lost their lives. So I need to work on a template for this, and maybe we can collaborate on that. I suspect there does need to be something about some jeopardy or some problem, as you say, to up the ante and get the interest going.
Terry,
so thank you for that.
Terry, has there been any research, or does anybody know whether anybody's actually examined, if it's worth examining, whether there is any structure to stories?
Oh yeah,
like a beginning,
believe me,
middle,
the
and
Hollywood
end.
blockbusters. Yeah, one book I would strongly recommend. One book that is called Houston, We Have a Narrative. I can't remember the name of the author, but the book is called Houston, We Have a Narrative, and it's by somebody who was both a scientist, and he then became a successful Hollywood producer, and he applied himself to training scientists in the art of making research proposals the way that they would pitch to a producer would pitch a film to potential backers. In other words, what is the story that your research is telling, which has got to include the jeopardy. So I think, so there are lots of books on structure.
Yeah, I'm rather thinking,
you know, send a note round if you like on those.
Yes, please, because I think I'm rather thinking that if somebody can imagine or knows the structure and, if you like, the functionality of storytelling, then maybe that can help them without it being too glaringly transparent when they've got to put together a pitch or a convincing vision or a story, that there's something that can guide them to that, shows some sort of insight into to what's happening. So it's not just happening by magic, if you like, or getting that unconscious competence thing that people attribute to this. Because rather like with you saying that we respond chemically to everything that happens to us, there must be an underlying structure in the way, in the pace and the rhythms and the forms of language that we're using to convey our message. So that is fascinating. In fact, I'd dearly love you, if you haven't already got one, to maybe reprise the number of books you've recommended today and possibly give us a reading list. Certainly that one, the Houston one sounds fascinating, and I'd also like to have a title for the philosopher that you mentioned earlier on. Was it Gilchrist?
Yes,
and maybe piece of work.
Gilchrist.
Yeah, piece of work on that as well. I'd be very interested in doing. But I think
I'll do that. I can type them into the better thing is if I write a one pager.
Yeah.
That picks out 7 or 8 books that I think are really must reads in this area.
Yeah. And does this creep into anthropology as well, or is this not in here too?
No, anthropology is involved. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Steve, are you happy to go over the 5 o'clock, because we've got Gordon and Adrian waiting with questions.
Let's do these. Let's do these questions. Is there any football on tonight? Well, we don't want to watch that anyway, do we? No. So, yeah, let's do a couple more questions if you're happy. Let's say we'll go on to maybe 15:15 tops. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
It's Gordon next, I think.
Go on then, Gordon.
Sorry, yes, I've shared in the link actually. Joseph Campbell, he was an Olympic athlete, and then he went on to do his own doctorate and studies. He studied world mythology. This is quite a few years ago. And he came up with this book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And that book, that story about the structure of stories and the trajectory of individuals on the path to personal growth and enlightenment was picked up by George Lucas, inspired most of the Star Wars original stories, and it's gone into many other areas as well. So I do just recommend that book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Brilliant.
And was Adrian? Do you have another?
Yeah, I was only just going to mention that, of course, the Greeks knew a thing or two about storytelling, and they had the 3 modes of persuasion, sort of ethos, pathos, and logos. So, and I've been using those for years and years and years. And of course, the other thing is another way of another word for a story is a sales pitch. And I've taught business analysts mumbledy years ago about when you're doing your reports and you're trying to sell a position, or project managers, you are selling to your audience.
Yes.
And you need to know how to sell.
Brilliant. Thank you, Adrian.
I see you guys placed a link to Houston. We have a narrative in the chat, so
that's the one.
Definitely follow that up. I wondered also, Terry, if in terms of scope and tone, that one also has to be selective or know or place your stories into context. I mean, how, you know, the challenge of maybe converting, dare I say, within these four walls, the civil service into becoming very open and really being, what's the word, authentic in its belief, or the words that it says about how what a listening, caring culture they have within there, which I'm pretty sure there's a fair bit of dissonance between that and people
say that again.
Being worried about what they say for fear of being blamed or trounced or belittled in some way. How do you? What's the route map for and the use of stories when you are embarking upon, I don't know, maybe wholesale cultural change within an organisation? Is it a strong element of the strategy to do this?
Very strong, and that's actually, many organisations now employ anthropologists. There's a book by a Financial Times journalist called Gillian Tett, I think her name is, called Anthrovision, which is a very, very good book. And it starts off by understanding the stories and the symbols and the culture that is the accepted way. The old thing about culture, there's the old joke about two fish swimming upstream, two young fish, and talking to each other, and a big old fish comes swimming downstream, and in passing them it says, how's the water? And one of the young fish turns to the other and says, what's water? Now, you are so immersed in culture that you don't know what it is that you're swimming in, and the job of an anthropologist is to identify those things that you take for granted and everybody else thinks are rather odd, and also to make to you some things that everybody else takes for granted and suggest that they might work in your situation as well. And the storytelling is about pitching the story in a way that it will be received by the hearer as a welcome addition. Pushing through an open door.
Yeah.
This is why interdisciplinary study is so important, actually, because none of this is in a single field. You can't do this in a single box.
Well, we don't see very much of it in project management education, formal project management education at all, do we? So it does sound as though it's possibly, maybe the wrong terminology, but it does seem to be a missing link in a whole series of change that we need to really turn it on its head. I know my background is behavioural science, and when I first entered project management, it was more that it was an engineer with a budget. That's what a project manager was, and you were dealing with engineers, you know. And I know, marching into some of the bigger organisations in my youth or my younger days, you really knew you were dealing with engineers who had no, I don't know, emotional intelligence, no empathy whatsoever. It was very cut and dried, let's say, those sorts of atmospheres. And yet the more we go on, even the PMI put their finger on it years ago, you know, that the key to successful project delivery is communication, the ability to really transmit information in a two-way dialogue, I think, to reinforce that. But it still remains seemingly outside and beyond the extant bodies of knowledge for this particular community. So if we are confining it to projects and project management, there's nothing that I can think of that I would have as a go-to qualification either in any of the large project management bodies. So again, maybe the case needs to be made to draw that in, or certainly those involved in other forms of education to add those on as huge slabs to their master's programs or their other vocational training, rather than seeing it as something that's extra or I don't know, maybe like your fish, you float to the top somehow. And the ones that do, when they're examined, are seen to have these skills and have them identified, but there's still no way of turning that over and and in a way providing some kind of, I don't know, simulator environment within an academic framework to because it's very performative, isn't it? It's almost like acting. I was almost inclined to throw in that another good way of maybe building up the skills that we need to tell stories is to look at what stand-ups do. A lot of stand-ups they're not it's not jokes with a punchline. Often it's 2 hours or 45 minutes of dialogue where they're seeking recognition, and they're getting people to recognize the bizarreness and the absurdity or indeed the truth of situations when they're telling their stories. And and some of them are better than others, but some of them are damn good at it, and very, very, very insightful. And again, so there is something within stand-up comedy too, which I think helps us sort of get up and convince others, and indeed ourselves, to find a decent way to do the right things right. Perhaps I should conclude on that. Doing the right things right again helps us do this. So I think I shall draw this to a close unless anybody wants to chuck in a last comment. Very insightful, Terry. We don't get many of these. I must. Well, we've had a few, but not for a while. Definitely a line where we still need to give it that attention. I think it does fit in very much with the RPM, the responsible project management,
Yes.
the caring conscientiousness, of what we do into that narrative. So as I said before, we will be summarising the conversation, putting it out on video, and hopefully a reading list and your slide set to those that have attended, and also through the various mailing lists and social media in the next few days. So on that note, I'd like to thank you, Terry, and for the rest of the audience to show their appreciation in whatever way they can. And hopefully you can come back at some point.
I'd love to.
Yeah, that would be a real treat, and very good to see you again.
Thank you,
as
Steve.
I said, I think this
Likewise.
is a lifelong learning and lifelong commitment. I think to making things better. That's the good stuff about this. So. Thank you all again. Have we got any news?
Thank you for your courteous reception. It's been great. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Steve.
Right. When's the next Vic team up then, Karen? It's July, isn't it?
Well, I was going to have a quick chat with you at the end.
Okay,
Yes, I haven't yet set up the next one, but we can do if enough people are still going to be around in July.
Well, they're all still at school, aren't they? So yeah, they're bound to be.
Depends when in July.
We'll have a consult. Okay, I know we were thinking of I think something like the 18th of July is a date that springs to mind. That might be a tad late. Otherwise, we'll be back in September sometime. I would think, although I'd like to squeeze one in July if people are around. And as I said, they are recorded for posterity. So I think you've got a couple of names slated for that anyway, Karen. But
we have. Looking
ahead to the future, if you want to have a go yourself, and I know Adrian's looking to do something sometime next year, don't be shy. Come forward, volunteer. It's not a white knuckle environment. We are trying to encourage people to speak freely and openly, and to share their experiences and learn as well. So on that note, it's a nice evening outside. I will therefore wish you all goodbye and see you again next time.
Thank you very much indeed.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Terry.
Thanks,
Terry.
So stick around, Karen. We'll have a chat. Yeah.
Thank you both very much. That was very enjoyable.
Well, thank you. It was fantastic.